So this is where we discuss advanced time-based techniques. And what we will discuss in this short video is actually two things previously mentioned in things you could do. One of them is routing one time-based plugin into another one, and the other one is dynamic processing of the actual plugins. So a problem that we sometimes run into when we are dealing with vocals, for instance, in a mix is that they were not recorded in an acoustical properly treated room with enough natural ambience to make it sound natural to the human ear. So we often have to try to find a solution to make this sound natural before it even gets to the actual reverb. So the solution to this problem is simply to develop first a natural space that then will become the send to the actual plate or hall. And by doing so, we are also creating its own pre-delay before the plate that we have much more control over. Now, looking at this picture, you can see that it is fairly a complicated routing, and there are several reasons why it is routed this way that I want to explain to you. But let's break it down how it's actually set up. So next to your vocal, and not in the actual effect section of the mix, you would create two stereo aux tracks, or you would create a mono and a stereo. Why a mono? Well, the vocal itself is a mono instrument, and it could go into the room, the ambience, mono in, stereo out. And then that stereo out signal would go into the stereo plate. The choice is yours. You can send the vocal to a stereo in, stereo out room, or a mono in, stereo out room. This is how this would look when it's properly routed. So you will see that we'll have a compressor, our ambient room, and another compressor on our first aux channel. And our second aux channel, we will have the plate and then another compressor to compress it again. So insert a compressor into your first aux channel. Set the parameter of the compressor to control the input, so play your vocal, and the sends will be at unity gain, not in pre on the first send. And try to achieve about 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction, and make up gain equally. So 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction usually results in about a 2 dB of makeup gain. Then insert a deverb or airverb or whatever ambient room plugin you want to use, and go for a setting of a room or ambience. Now we want to have the mix of this at 100%, and we're going to control the actual level and blend with the vocal, not by send level, but this time we're actually going against the grain and we're going to blend it with the actual main fader of that room. Now we will repeat that step of inserting a time-based plugin, but this time without the compressor. So the deverb or airverb or whatever reverb you want to use, you insert into the channel, insert one of the second aux channel we previously created. Then we have to create a send, first from the vocal to the room, add unity gain, but not in pre-fader, label that send room, or you can label it ambience. Then we create a send from the room, but also at unity gain and in pre-fader mode. Since we are blending the room and ambience with the lead vocal by lowering a fader and not by lowering the send as we do in basic time processing, we have to ensure that the send is not reflecting the low level of the fader. Therefore, the send going from the ambient to the plate will have to be in pre-fader to achieve maximum output into the plate. Now, in addition, we want to compress the outputs of these reverbs, and we want to do that with sidechain compression. So we have to create another send, a sidechain, and remember all sidechains are mono. And we will input them to the sidechain inputs of the both compressors on both aux channels. So at the end, it will look like something like this. Looking at this image, you can see your compression on the input of the room effect channel. Then you have sidechains going to both output compressors on the room and the plate. You have the insert of the room and the plate by itself. You have the sense from the vocal going to the room and from the room to the plate. Now there are a few things you got to make sure you don't forget. Make sure that you set the sidechain input to the appropriate bus you assigned on the vocals. Make sure you enable the sidechain, and your settings should be not too aggressive. So make sure that ratio, attack time, and release time are similar to what you see here, and that your threshold should be set to achieve just about 2, maximum 4 dB of gain reduction whenever the vocal actually triggers to open the compressor's action. Remember, usually makeup gain is about 75% to 80% of the reduction to achieve the same level that you had before the compression. And that's it. So now let's talk about what kind of processing you should apply to your master output for the mix that will actually go to the client for them to listen. And also for you to be able to hear how your mix is affected by mastering. It is very possible that mastering is going to affect some of the louder elements in your song, like your vocal and your kick. So adding compression and other dynamic processing to your master fader to just listen to the result can really improve your final product. So when do we want to start using master output processing? Well, applying compression to your master output during macro mixing will affect the way you mix. Now that you're closer to a final result, we can start adding a little bit of dynamic processing right in your micro mixing stage. So start with a little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression, a limiter, and listen for the subtle changes that will happen. You possibly will have to adjust your individual kick, snare, and vocal level, the loudest elements in your song, because compression and limiting is going to reduce them slightly. So this is a good way to make some fine adjustments on the individual faders. Now you can also apply, instead of applying compression to your master fader, you can apply very light compression to individual subgroups, which will also demonstrate to you what happens in mastering, except that you don't have to take those off before mastering. It helps you reduce the dynamic range of your song, but with more control over individual elements. Now constantly watch the compression, because when you are adjusting your faders, you are also pushing harder or lower into your compressor and therefore changing the result. You want to avoid excessive compression at all costs. Be very gentle with the amount of compression you will apply, because that type of compression is very audible and it can destroy a lot of the great automation things and great volume changes that you have made prior in the macro and micro mixing stage. Now keep in mind that it does change the dynamic range of your mix overall, but applying compression and limiting to your output does not give you as much control as doing it individually. The compressor is always going to react to the loudest part in your mix, which for example will probably be vocals and kick, sometimes the snare. So these elements will be reduced and you will slightly have to make up for that on the individual channels, or if possible, like on the vocal, on the lead sub mixer. So start with very light settings. Now overall, a lot of people prefer optical compressors for their smoothness over VCA fat compressors. And like I mentioned before, you want to make sure you don't exceed 2 dB of gain reduction. It will be really audible if you do. Typical settings are probably 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, slow attack, slow release. I've seen release times all the way up to in the 800s, 600, 800s, attack times 860 and above. So you want it to come in slow, unless it's a super transient mix where you want to catch some of the peaks a little quicker, but then you probably will have to be even more careful with your gain reduction. Now it's very powerful to use multiband compression for this type of master output compression, because you can apply different compression to the different bandwidths. For your kick and for your snare, you can apply specific setting to control them a little more without affecting the other ranges. So now that you added your compression, you can tweak your overall mix with a little bit of EQ. If you have a linear phase EQ, you will have better sonic quality because of its phase clarity. Phase clarity is happening because it does not change the phase of the audio when you apply gain or attenuation on specific frequencies, but that happens at an expense of added latency. So that's why linear phase EQs usually do not work on individual tracks, because their latency will change the timing of the audio too much. Now remember, go light, just like with the compression. There's no need to exceed 2 dB of gain or attenuation on any frequency, and if it is necessary for you to apply that much EQ, then you probably should go back to the individual tracks to find the instruments and frequencies that will get your mix closer to that final result you're looking for, or that you're now achieving through master output EQing. Carefully enhance the sheen, which is the really bright, breathy sound of the mix, and that translates very well on all kinds of systems. And that's usually the highs above 10K, 12K. Very lightly shelf that. Add a little bit more bottom. Unless you already have too much bottom, then maybe you shouldn't. But a lot of times it helps me just to add half a dB or 1 dB between 50 and 80 Hertz. 68 Hertz is usually where I aim for. And then work a little bit on the high mids. Keep the bandwidth wide and push a little bit around the 6K to 8K range. Maybe even a little lower, 3 to 4K, maybe 1 dB. And you will see how your mix opens up a little bit. And last, the third plugin we're going to insert is a limiter. Now, some of you have other limiters than Maxim, which is the one that comes with Pro Tools. And you should probably use those. I'm personally not a huge fan of Maxim. I think it's a little harsh, and it's very audible when used, and especially when overused. But the trick with limiters really is, again, to be very, very careful. You want to get it up to as closely as you can to the output that should read 0.1 or even 0, but be careful, you could actually create clipping. But you want to avoid exceeding 3 dB of gain reduction. Slower releases, obviously when it kicks in, you don't want it to immediately let go again. It will make your track sound like it's pumping. So you want to have a slower release. But it depends a lot on how transient the material is. I often myself use 2 limiters with different sound qualities. So I might use one very fast one that will only have 1 dB of gain reduction just to limit the peaks. And then use a second one with much slower reaction times to bring the RMS up. Now, if you overdo limitation on your output, it will really translate to the listener and sound very overcompressed. And since you probably heard of something called the loudness wars, which is records trying to get louder and louder and louder over the last 2 decades, we are now entering a time where we have companies like Apple and their iTunes that wants us to mix back down to -18 to -15 RMS. A lot of the records that you hear nowadays are in the -10 to -9 RMS range, and some of the dance records, EDM records especially, can go all the way up to -3, -4, which is literally no more dynamic range. I want to give you a quick example of what my typical setup looks like, just as an overview. And as you can see here on the left, I'm in Logic, I'm not in Pro Tools. And I usually start out with a little bit of linear phase EQ with very slight setting, and you can see the shelf. You can see the shelf here of the highs, and you can see a little bit of bump here, and then you see a little bit of a boost here in the high mids. Then I'll usually go into a very slight, very low optical compression. As you can see, it's optical. It uses automatic recovery, and it has an attack time of 150, and my ratio is 1.5. Then I will even sometimes multi-compress after that. Now I can either use this multi-compressor to reduce my lows, or I could actually, as I've shown you before, I can actually expand the lows if I need more attack with a multi-band compressor. So this is a whole nother level of changing how you track fields. It can be an EQ and a compressor in one if used properly. Then, one of my favorite things, I like to add a little bit of saturation. So I'm adding harmonics into the mix, and I'm adding different things at different bandwidths. Some of them might be a tape saturation, some of them might be just a natural tube saturation. It really depends on the song, and it's used very, very lightly, but also because a saturator lets me do it on the mid-side field, I can apply certain saturations only to the sides, making my mix a little wider. And then comes my first limiter, and I usually use the L2 Ultra Maximizer. And as you can see, my output ceiling on this limiter is only 1 dB because I still have more stages to go to. I don't want to go up to the full 0 dB yet. But I've changed it from automatic recovery to about 50 milliseconds. So I want to be in control of how it releases. The quantization stays at 24-bit, and I've lowered my threshold to achieve about 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction. So understanding this means I'm pushing the mix up to reach -1 dB in peak level. And then one of my favorite toys, Oxford Inflator. It's an interesting plugin that increases the transient signals more, and it's almost like acts like an expander that has an envelope. And I use this very lightly just to give my mix even more punch and lower its output also to -0.5. So I'm not quite at the full level yet. And then my last and least, I use the L3 Ultra Maximizer, which is really just an easy version of their multi-band limiter that applies different limitations to different things. And but since I love the loud and proud setting, usually this is where I dither down to 16-bit. If I'm going to 16-bit, I'll have to change the setting depending on what mix I'm actually printing. If I print it for 24-bit, I will have to keep the quantization at 24-bit. You see that my output ceiling is 0.1, and I'm lowering this to get about 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction, which usually gets me within the -12 to -10 dB RMS range of my mixes, if my mix is already at -3. So this is what you should use: slight compression, a little bit of EQ, slight limiter, and as you can see in the instructions, that you can either use the Maxim's internal dithering or you can use power dithering afterwards. I personally actually think that power dithering is one of the best dithers out there, and probably a better choice than using Maxim's dither. So now let's discuss the stems that we need to print at the end of our micromix, and after we have finished, we have reached this point of finally deciding that we are done and that the mix is radio ready. Well, what are the reasons for stems? One of the main things is to have the ability in mastering to recombine them to adjust levels, or even just for yourself without actually having to have the Pro Tools session or Logic session, wherever mixes were created. You give yourself and the client the ability to combine them. So that's why it's so important that they all start at the same time in a new session and make slight adjustments to the stems themselves. Also in mastering, if there's a particular problem between bass or kick or the vocals and the track, the mastering engineer can apply different EQs and compression to the individual stems instead of trying to fix it in the full mix, which is a lot harder and sometimes literally impossible. So that's really a powerful option you are giving the mastering engineer, and it's really more for a backup. They prefer they are able to master your full mix, but in a situation where it is necessary to control the bass separately from the kick, for instance, in mastering, this is a good way to leave the options open for the mastering engineers to apply that. One other thing is actually music directors. When I was music director for NSYNC in '97 for their first European tour, one of the things that we created was backing tracks out of the stems that were playing behind us as the band. So nowadays there's almost no professional act that doesn't have some kind of tracks playing behind them, often the background vocals, some of the keyboard parts, even the drum loops on top of what the live drummer is playing. The act starts sounding like the CD, and it's often preferred. This would be a lot of extra work if it's not already done when we're printing the stems, because if you would send, for instance, the MD your Pro Tools session and he doesn't have all the plugins that you have, he won't really be able to create the same sound. So creating this now while you're printing your mixes is actually the correct way to do it. Now, one thing you should consider though is that the word stems is not the same in film and TV as it is in music. If a director of a movie or TV show asks you for stems, he is asking for the voiceover, the sound effects, and the music separate. He's not asking for drums, vocals, bass, keyboards. So keep that in mind. The proper way to print your stems is by, first of all, bypassing any plugins you have on the master fader. The reason for that is simple. If your plugins are set to react to all the tracks levels coming in, they will act differently when you only send the drums or when you only send the bass. That means when combining the stems, our main goal, which is that when all stems are combined, they sound exactly like your final uncompressed master, will not be achievable. So make sure that all plugins are bypassed on your master fader. Now you want to mute individual tracks and not the subgroups, simply because each bounce has to include all the effects used on its source tracks. So if I'm bouncing drums and I have a guitar reverb on it, and then I'm bouncing guitar and also have a guitar reverb on it, I would then therefore double up the volume of the guitar reverb, and the final combination of the stems would not represent the final mix anymore. So you have to mute individual tracks and not the subgroups. If you mute the subgroups, the effect sends are coming from the individual tracks and will still be heard. Now, if you have set up some sidechain routing, let's say you are compressing the bass from the kick, for instance, then you have to be careful, because that still has to happen. That means your kick still has to play when you are bouncing down the bass stem. But we shouldn't hear the kick. So one solution to still achieve the same sidechaining is, for that particular stem bounce, you simply assign the kick to a non-existing output. So output would say none. And the kick would still play through the sidechain to the compressor, still compressing the bass, but won't be audible. Now, because a lot of mastering houses are running PCs with a system called Sequoia, and I've even heard of Unix mastering systems, Mac, PC. The only true file format that is cross-compatible to all computers is WAVs. AIFF is really a Mac format. So make sure that all your stems and all your files you print, even in the final mixes, are printed or bounced in WAV format. And one thing that often happens is that I see engineers not setting up the correct output and actually choosing a mono output or the wrong format by printing to separate mono files instead of stereo interleaved. So make sure you're using stereo interleaved and choose the right stereo output in your session to bounce your stems or final mixes. So what bounces do we have to create, or what stems do we have to bounce? Well, one of them is the drums, and that means all your sequence drums and live percussive sounds, which means also the drum loop, the trees, the congas, the shakers, the clap beat, all the live drums. Then we have bass. Now that's an easy one, since there is only one track for the bass. But I have had sessions where there are different bass sounds, and they would be on your bass track combined. All your guitars. Now, some engineer might make the choice of making separate stems for the acoustic and the electric guitar, but for our project it's easy enough to just bounce all the guitars, acoustic and electric, down to one stem. All the keys. So we have piano, pad, string, synth. Don't forget the gated pad and its trigger, which you won't hear since it's only there to open and close the gate. Lead vocals. Now there are two tracks. There's the regular lead vocal and the ad-lib lead vocal. And the background vocals, which should be at this point one stereo track. Now this doesn't always mean that every session has a one track stereo background vocal track. I've often leave my background vocals separate so I can reblend them for different choruses, and that would mean I would now bounce down 12 or 16 background vocal tracks down to one stereo stem. And last, we have the special effects. That should be all your top effects 2 bottom effects, and your Sugar Rush sample. Now a good reason why to put the Sugar Rush sample on a track like the special effects is that this is one of those sounds that is usually hard to place in the mix and can often be too low or too loud. And since the sound effects on the special effect stem are only playing sporadically throughout the mix and hardly ever when the Sugar Rush sample is playing, it will make it easier for you to combine the stems and raise the Sugar Rush sample through automating the stem by itself and raise it or lower it if necessary. So now you are at the point where we can print our final mixes. Now there are two types of final mixes that we should consider printing when we finalize this session. One, to listen. This is something you would send to the A&R guy or the client themselves for them to hear what the final product would sound like as close as possible to what a mastered version would sound like. So for this one, we would have a processed master with all of our dynamic processing on the master output. But that is not something you can send to a mastering engineer because you give him very little options to refine your mix. So to use, we will actually use unprocessed masters. And that is the same for the TV tracks, which are the performance tracks without a lead vocal, the instrumental, the vocal up and vocal down mixes. So again, our types are processed, and you should print this one in 16-bit since it's easier to burn that to CD if you don't have a program like WaveBurner that can dither it down for you. And all you have to really do is the main mix. Then your second type, the unprocessed one, you want to do main mix, vocal up and vocal down. It's normally we would also print TV or performance tracks, an instrumental track, and sometimes even the a cappella. But you already have the a cappella in your lead vocal and background vocal stem. Now printing the mixes is done by bouncing or exporting, which means you just pick the correct output, go to bounce, and bounce down those outputs for the complete range of the song. Or it's done by internal folding. Now what that means is if you have an analog summing mixer, for instance, then you would use the same session to re-record through the summing mixer back to a new set of stereo tracks. And finally, there's the external print. This is kind of uncommon nowadays since nobody really has WaveBurner hard disk recorders, DAT recorders, or external CD burners anymore. But it's very possible that somebody could print down to a 1/2-inch analog tape machine that still has it. And that would be considered external printing. Now the final mix, one thing we want to do is first to deactivate all the plugins on the master and print the mixes in 24-bit with making sure the power dither is disengaged. There shouldn't be any dithering on your main output. And that would be our main mix, and that's just what it says. It's everything on. Then our vocal up, leads and background vocals need to be turned up by increasing the volume on each individual track by 1.5 dB. Now you cannot achieve this by increasing the level or decreasing the level on the subgroup fader because that would not increase the reverb that is used on the vocals or any effect equally to the raising of the volume itself. So it has to be done on the individual track, and it can simply be done by either changing the automation or adding a trim plugin as your last plugin and trimming up or down the output. And the same thing for the vocal down mix. You have to do leads and background vocals on the individual tracks by lowering all of them by 1.5 dB. And remember to do it on each fader so that the send levels adjust accordingly. Now you want to print the one that goes to the A&R guy or the client themselves. You want to activate all the plugins on the master fader. And you want to print this with dither engaged. So either you use the Maxim dither, or even better, use as fourth plugin, use power dither and set it to 16-bit and then print your mix. So here are all the tracks that need to be sent to your instructor. All your stems, which are drums, bass, guitars, keys, lead vocal, background vocal, and the special effects. All your final mixes in 24-bit, that means no processing is on them, and you have your main mix, your vocal up, and your vocal down. And remember, vocal up and vocal down mixes does not mean you just send the vocals. It is the full mix with the vocals turned up and the full mix with the vocals turned down. Then you have your final mix in 16-bit that has all the mastering processing on it, and that is the one that you should also post to the discussion post. And finally, your Pro Tools session that should have been named Last First Final Mix -MST. Now, make sure you submit this through Gobbler to your instructor. Your file size at 11 tracks should be over 500 megabytes. It's 11 tracks plus 1 Pro Tools session. Now, remember, this is very important. Do not send your full session again. So the audio files are not necessary since your instructor already has them. But there is an exception to this. If you decided to re-record any audio, for instance, editing the effects, stutter editing, or you created a bounce of something internally, that means you created new audio files. At that point, you have to resubmit the entire session, which would include 1.2 gigabytes of audio files and 600 megabytes of stems and final mixes. So, have fun, enjoy mixing and finalizing this session.